What if I told you there was a dynasty so wealthy it rivaled the fortunes of history's biggest magnates, yet it still fell prey to scandal, assassinations, and rebellion? Welcome to the Umayyad Caliphate, the second Islamic empire that rose on the back of massive conquests across North Africa and Spain, wielded an estimated $500 billion war chest, and left behind iconic wonders like the Dome of the Rock. But beneath the glitter of gold and marble lies a web of controversial secrets, accusations of favoritism, brutal massacres, and a bloodline curse that forced one heir to flee and found a whole new realm in Córdoba. In this video, we're plunging into the hidden intrigues of the Umayyad court, where new money ambition clashed with calls for piety, and empires were built or undone on the flip of a coin. Imagine stepping back in time to an era when fortunes could shift overnight, when entire empires sprang up from desert sands as swiftly as modern media moguls build their dynasties. That sense of sudden wealth, that new money phenomenon, was exactly what the Umayyad Caliphate experienced after their rapid conquests in the mid-7th century. Historians often compare their newfound power to the rise of figures like William Randolph Hearst, whose media empire transformed him from just another publisher into a baron of influence and extravagance. The Umayyads, similarly, burst onto the global scene on a wave of conquest spoils and lucrative trade routes, especially along the Silk Road and the Mediterranean. One moment, they were known in a tribal context as members of a prominent Quraysh clan in Arabia. The next, they were controlling territories from Spain to Central Asia, and people whispered that their treasure stores rivaled the greatest fortunes of any age. Scholars at institutions like the University of Chicago have estimated, in line with certain Forbes-style methodologies, that if you adjust for modern currency, their empire was worth around $500 billion. That's a staggering figure, especially considering it sprang up within a single generation of the Rashidun Caliphate's end. The question, then, is how this Umayyad clan, once primarily known for its influence in Mecca, with a streak of early opposition to the Prophet Muhammad, transformed from new money upstarts into something more akin to old money, the kind of entrenched aristocracy we associate with old European families, or the famously established wealthy families in America. In fact, if you glance at historical analogies, some experts compare the Umayyads' path to the transformation of the Rockefeller dynasty in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Just as John D. Rockefeller used corporate boards, trusts, and strategic expansions to shape an oil empire, the Umayyads employed diwans, bureaucratic boards introduced by their leader Muawiyah I, and a policy of Arabization. This, as Wikipedia clarifies, allowed them to centralize administration in Damascus and run a massive territory almost like a corporate entity. The result was an empire that spanned millions of square kilometers and encompassed a melting pot of ethnicities, languages, and religions. We know from classical Islamic sources, including some references in the works of al-Tabari and al-Baladuri, that Muawiyah IV was initially the governor of Syria and eventually seized the caliphate after the assassination of Ali ibn Abi Talib in 661 CE. He moved the political center to Damascus, deviating from the older seat in Medina, and effectively shifted the entire cultural gravity of the Islamic world westward. This style of governance, with diwans systematically overseeing revenue, the military and administrative tasks, was unique. Some historians have argued that the efficiency of these diwans mirrored the tight-fisted corporate control of the Rockefellers, who pioneered trust building and expansion within the oil industry in the late 1800s. just as Rockefeller consolidated smaller companies into the giant Standard Oil, Muawiyah and his successors consolidated the various tribal and provincial systems into a cohesive, if occasionally fractious, empire under the Umayyad umbrella. But perhaps the most striking parallel is in cultural patronage. If you think of Guggenheim's famous museums in modern times, those glamorous art institutions that declared a new era of high culture, well, the Umayyads had their own version in the form of architectural wonders, like the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and the Great Mosque of Damascus. According to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Dome of the Rock, completed under the rule of Abd al-Malik, is not only one of the earliest surviving Islamic monuments, but also a symbolic statement of Umayyad power and religious legitimacy. Scholars from the British Museum note that the gold-topped shrine, built around 691 to 692 CE, represented a turning point where Islamic art and architecture forged a distinct identity separate from earlier Byzantine or Sasanian styles. Yet, in the same breath, it functioned kind of like a brand new museum funded by powerful benefactors. In other words, a statement to the world that said, "We are here, we have the wealth, and we intend to shape the cultural narrative." As the Umayyads expanded further, stretching across North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula, eventually establishing a presence in what is now Spain, people started to see them as more than just a clan of new money. They began to resemble the old money families that become institutions unto themselves. A big part of that transformation was the shift toward hereditary rule. Early Islamic governance, especially under the Rashidun Caliphate, involved a more elective or consultative process for selecting caliphs, at least in theory. But the Umayyads firmly established dynastic succession, meaning the throne, or caliphal seat, would pass from father to son or from one close male relative to another. This was reminiscent of how the Medici family in Renaissance Italy maintained a covert but tight grip on Florentine politics. Everyone knew the Medicis were in charge, even though they sometimes operated behind the scenes or masked their authority under nominal republican structures. For the Umayyads, especially after Muawiyah designated his son Yazid I as successor, the caliphate took on a hereditary monarchy's trappings, effectively ignoring prior calls for a more consultative or communal system. What sealed the Umayyad status as old money was their control of trade networks. Historians at the Collector have pointed out that controlling Mediterranean maritime routes and key overland Silk Road passages was akin to the Grosvenor family's real estate empire in modern London. Just as the Grosvenors shaped the city's prime property assets, like Mayfair and Belgravia, the Umayyads leveraged their dominion over shipping lanes and caravan trails to enrich themselves. Levantine ports linked them to the Mediterranean world, while caravans across the Middle East tapped into the Silk Road's wealth. The result? A steady influx of goods, taxes, and tributes allowed them to keep building new cities, founding new mosques, and sustaining their lavish courts. They weren't just a band of conquerors living off the spoils of war. They became entrenched economic players, turning Damascus into a cosmopolitan hub, reminiscent of how Renaissance Florence boomed under the Medici, or how industrial Pittsburgh owed much of its growth to the steel barons of the 19th century. Of course, every aristocracy has its share of critics and controversies. In the Umayyads' case, allegations of secularism, meaning they were more politically motivated and less pious than they should have been, along with bitter Shia opposition, sowed constant doubts about their legitimacy. This aspect parallels how the Vanderbilts in the United States face social stigma for being brash, new money industrialists. Even though the Umayyads eventually slid into that comfortable sphere of old money, aristocrats, their critics argued, they lost the early Islamic communities' spiritual simplicity, focusing too much on worldly power. Many Shia accounts, particularly those focusing on events like the Battle of Karbala, place blame on Yazid III for the tragedy that befell Hussein ibn Ali and his companions. That single event, still commemorated every year in Muharram, cast a long shadow over the entire Umayyad dynasty, making some Muslims see them as usurpers and oppressors. The complaint that the Umayyads strayed from the Prophet's teachings became a recurring theme in Islamic historiography. In the hushed corridors of power, truth is often the faintest whisper, veiled behind gilded screens and rumor-laden tongues. So it was in 7th century Arabia, where shifting loyalties, sprawling dynastic ambitions, and whispered intrigues shaped the course of empires. In this realm lived Muawiyah I, a figure whose cunning and ambition had already pulled him from the periphery of Islamic leadership into its very center. And standing on the opposite side was Hassan ibn Ali, a man whose legacy was tied inseparably to the Prophet Muhammad himself. Hassan was the grandson of the Prophet, son of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and revered by many as a potential rightful leader in the new age of the Islamic Caliphate. Their rivalry, deep-rooted and laden with conflicting claims to authority, culminated, according to many accounts, in one of the most unsettling forms of violence known to dynastic histories: political poisoning. Although widely retold by various historical sources, including the voluminous writings of al-Tabari, this alleged act remains draped in debate, speculation, and conflicting interpretations. Yet, the possibility that Muawiyah orchestrated the poisoning of Hassan in 670 CE stands as an enduring rumor that refuses to fade, capturing the imaginations of historians, theologians, and storytellers across centuries. To understand how this saga unfolded, one must return to a time of fierce upheaval in the Islamic world. The death of the Prophet Muhammad left the nascent Muslim community grappling over who should succeed him. Among those who inherited this profound responsibility was Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law. Ali's tenure was tumultuous, marred by civil wars and deep political rifts that led to the first fitna. In this whirlwind of conflict, Muawiyah emerged as a formidable governor of Syria, holding a cunning sense of political maneuvering that allowed him to challenge Ali's legitimacy. When Ali was assassinated, many eyes turned to his son Hassan, who had inherited both the loyalty of many followers and the complicated legacy of leadership. Still, Hassan's path was anything but straightforward, as Muawiyah continued to expand his authority from Damascus, establishing himself as a counterweight to Ali's line. The tension between Hassan and Muawiyah, each claiming his own right to lead, simmered over the months. Eventually, Hassan, amidst internal conflicts and with an eye toward preventing further bloodshed among Muslims, entered into an agreement with Muawiyah, the details of which are themselves disputed. Some believe it was a peace treaty aimed at unifying the community under one ruler, with the proviso that after Muawiyah's death, the caliphate would return to Hassan, or at least remain in the household of the Prophet. Others consider it an uneasy truce, secured by Muawiyah's promise to refrain from persecuting Ali's supporters. Whichever version is closest to the truth, there is broad consensus that Hassan stepped aside, leaving Muawiyah as the unrivaled caliph for the moment. Yet behind the scenes, a far more perilous game was unfolding. Muawiyah's aspiration to ensure the dynastic ascendancy of his son Yazid. According to certain accounts, this ambition would not be realized so smoothly if Hassan remained alive. given the reverence and loyalty he commanded in significant parts of the Islamic community. The seeds of the alleged poisoning were thus sown in the rich, tension-saturated soil of 7th century Arabian politics. The palace in Damascus rang with hushed speculations about the future. Yazid, Muawiyah's son, was seen by many as lacking the spiritual and moral standing of the Prophet's household, but Muawiyah was determined to cement him as heir. In a realm where military might, strategic marriages, and cunning alliances determined the balance of power, it was no secret that removing a rival could secure one's throne. Leaders across the medieval world had turned to poison as an expedient method to dispatch threats without raising armies. And the annals of history, whether in the Plantagenet courts of England or amid the labyrinthine intrigues of the Medici family in Italy, are rife with examples of silent, lethal subterfuge. Thus it comes as no great surprise that many historians, especially within Shia narratives, suspect Muawiyah or his agents of having orchestrated the discreet assassination of Hassan ibn Ali. One of the earliest extant references we have to this possibility lies in the works of al-Tabari, a 9th to 10th century historian whose monumental History of the Prophets and Kings is frequently considered a foundational text in Islamic historiography. Al-Tabari collected numerous accounts, some of which point to poison as the cause of Hassan's death, implicitly attributing the orchestration to Muawiyah. Yet al-Tabari himself did not always commit to definitive conclusions. His method was to compile various narrations, offering them as windows into how people of earlier generations recounted events. In some of these narrations, rumors swirl around an agreement with one of Hassan's wives, or a trusted associate who was somehow induced by wealth or by intimidation to administer a lethal dose. The question is whether these narratives reflect historical fact or the polemical environment of early Islamic politics, where champions of Ali's line would readily blame their adversaries for any tragedy that befell the Prophet's family. In Shia tradition, the possibility of Muawiyah's involvement is largely accepted as truth, at least within the theological context that sees the family of Ali as rightful heirs to the Prophet. The idea that an ambitious caliph would stoop to assassination to clear the path for his son resonates with centuries of dynastic betrayals, echoing in countless cautionary tales of power. In these accounts, Muawiyah's role as a usurper is underscored, and the poisoning of Hassan is framed as a defining moment that set the stage for later outrages. Most tragically, the events at Karbala, where Hassan's younger brother Hussein faced the forces of Yazid in a bloody confrontation that still reverberates through the Shia commemorations of Ashura. Muawiyah, in such narratives, is cast as the mastermind who recognized that so long as Hassan lived, the legitimacy of Umayyad rule would be open to question. By dealing with Hassan quietly, the foundation for a dynastic empire was laid. Indeed, one might call it the poison that crowned a dynasty. For once Hassan was gone, Muawiyah could more confidently promote Yazid's succession, culminating in what many regard as the official birth of the Umayyad Caliphate, a hereditary monarchy under the cloak of Islamic leadership. However, it is important to note that not all historians or Islamic scholars agree on Muawiyah's culpability. Some point to lack of definitive proof and the possibility that Hassan suffered from a recurring illness. There are also traditions that question the reliability of early narrators who may have carried a biased agenda, weaving a cloak of conspiracy around what might have been a natural death. Political rivalries in the Islamic world of that era were fierce, and the written record, often penned under the patronage of one faction or another, can reflect those biases. Skeptics caution that attributing every misfortune to a grand scheme can risk overlooking mundane explanations. Meanwhile, supporters of Ali's lineage maintain that to dismiss the poisoning theory is to ignore the political currents of the time, where Muawiyah's desire to preserve power was both urgent and cunning. Indeed, if one interprets the events leading to Yazid's rule, culminating in the tragedy of Karbala, the notion that Hassan's death was no mere accident gains considerable plausibility in the eyes of those who revere the memory of Ali's family. What sets the poisoning of Hassan ibn Ali apart is the deep spiritual dimension involved. Hassan was no ordinary political figure. He was the grandson of the Prophet, cherished by Muslims for his lineage, piety, and scholarship. Within the Shia tradition, he holds the status of an imam, a spiritual leader entrusted with the guidance of the faithful. His silent removal resonates far beyond the realm of mere political gambit. If indeed Muawiyah sanctioned this act, it was more than an attack on a rival. It was, in the eyes of many, an offense against the very family of the Prophet. Yet Muawiyah's supporters might frame him as a leader who faced a restless, fractious community and sought unity at any cost. The official narrative from the Umayyad perspective often portrayed Muawiyah as the man who saved the Muslim world from further chaos after the civil wars, ushering in a period of stability. If Hassan posed a constant risk of reigniting old allegiances and fracturing the Muslim community once again, then, so the argument goes, Muawiyah might have felt compelled to eliminate him in the name of preserving the peace. This line of reasoning, though chilling, was not uncommon in narrations recounted events. In some of these narrations, rumors swirl around an agreement with one of Hassan's wives, or a trusted associate who was somehow induced by wealth or by intimidation to administer a lethal dose. The question is whether these narratives reflect historical fact or the polemical environment of early Islamic politics, where champions of Ali's line would readily blame their adversaries for any tragedy that befell the Prophet's family. In Shia tradition, the possibility of Muawiyah's involvement is largely accepted as truth, at least within the theological context that sees the family of Ali as rightful heirs to the Prophet. The idea that an ambitious caliph would stoop to assassination to clear the path for his son resonates with centuries of dynastic betrayals, echoing in countless cautionary tales of power. In these accounts, Muawiyah's role as a usurper is underscored, and the poisoning of Hassan is framed as a defining moment that set the stage for later outrages. Most tragically, the events at Karbala, where Hassan's younger brother Hussein faced the forces of Yazid in a bloody confrontation that still reverberates through the Shia commemorations of Ashura. Muawiyah, in such narratives, is cast as the mastermind who recognized that so long as Hassan lived, the legitimacy of Umayyad rule would be open to question. By dealing with Hassan quietly, the foundation for a dynastic empire was laid. Indeed, one might call it the poison that crowned a dynasty. For once Hassan was gone, Muawiyah could more confidently promote Yazid's succession, culminating in what many regard as the official birth of the Umayyad Caliphate, a hereditary monarchy under the cloak of Islamic leadership. However, it is important to note that not all historians or Islamic scholars agree on Muawiyah's culpability. Some point to lack of definitive proof and the possibility that Hassan suffered from a recurring illness. There are also traditions that question the reliability of early narrators who may have carried a biased agenda, weaving a cloak of conspiracy around what might have been a natural death. Political rivalries in the Islamic world of that era were fierce, and the written record, often penned under the patronage of one faction or another, can reflect those biases. Skeptics caution that attributing every misfortune to a grand scheme can risk overlooking mundane explanations. Meanwhile, supporters of Ali's lineage maintain that to dismiss the poisoning theory is to ignore the political currents of the time, where Muawiyah's desire to preserve power was both urgent and cunning. Indeed, if one interprets the events leading to Yazid's rule, culminating in the tragedy of Karbala, the notion that Hassan's death was no mere accident gains considerable plausibility in the eyes of those who revere the memory of Ali's family. It was the year 680 CE, and the desert sky above Karbala lay vast, shimmering under the intense heat of the midday sun. The atmosphere seemed pregnant with a silent dread, as if it knew a cataclysmic event was about to unfold beneath its watchful gaze. No matter how often the shifting sands of Middle Eastern history were stained by blood, few tragedies would ever claim such a lasting legacy as what happened here, on a day that irreversibly changed the course of Islamic history. The story has been told and retold in many ways, through laments, epic poetry, scholarly chronicles, and fervent sermons. But as we peel back the layers of myth and emotion, we find a truth more complex and perhaps even more chilling than simple good versus evil. This was not just a religious clash or a random outbreak of violence. It was, by many accounts, a calculated power move engineered by a man named Yazid I, determined to crush the spark of Shia dissent. And in the aftermath, like so many ruling elites in the annals of history, Yazid's court worked meticulously to shape the narrative, downplay the bloodshed, and recast a starkly political crackdown as a tragic necessity, or, in some versions, as a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. To grasp the heart of this secret, you have to picture the fledgling Islamic empire as a tapestry of tribal alliances and shaky pledges of loyalty. The Prophet Muhammad had died just decades before, and the question of who should lead the Muslim community had unleashed waves of tension, culminating in various disputes and civil conflicts. Deep beneath the surface of outward unity, rifts widened. One of the deepest of these rifts pitted those who revered the Prophet's family, particularly through his cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, against the powerful new Umayyad dynasty that had seized the reins of leadership. Over time, this disagreement grew into a theological divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims, but in the earliest decades it was largely a question of political legitimacy and tribal power. Who should govern the faithful, and by what authority? In the swirl of those questions stood two pivotal figures, Hussein ibn Ali, grandson of the Prophet, and Yazid I, the newly installed ruler of the Umayyad Caliphate. Yazid inherited the mantle from his father, Muawiyah I, who had managed, through both shrewd diplomacy and ruthless maneuvers, to solidify his position as caliph after a series of tumultuous events that included civil war and political assassinations. Muawiyah's era was complicated, but he was, at the very least, savvy enough to create some semblance of cohesion within the Muslim empire. When Yazid came to power, however, the question of whether this empire would remain united or fracture along old fault lines was far from resolved. Many believed that leadership belonged morally, if not legally, to the Prophet's direct descendants, particularly Hussein ibn Ali. These feelings weren't solely about lineage. They were also about the integrity of Islamic leadership. Hussein, revered for his piety and closeness to the Prophet, was seen by many as the rightful figure to carry forward the core values of Islam. Yazid, by contrast, was less respected as a religious figure and far more known for his court's extravagance, nepotism, and desire for absolute control. The stage for a showdown was set when Hussein refused to pledge allegiance to Yazid. To some, it was an act of political rebellion; to others, a moral stance. Hussein's supporters, especially in the region of Kufa, present-day Iraq, began to urge him to challenge Yazid's claim and establish an alternative leadership grounded in the Prophet's family. Countless letters flowed from Kufa to Hussein, promising support and protection if he would only come and lead them. Spurred by these pleas, Hussein departed from his home with a modest entourage, family members, loyal companions, and a handful of supporters, traveling toward Kufa. That journey ended in the desert plains of Karbala, where Yazid's forces intercepted him. The number of troops on Yazid's side far outstripped the few dozen men who stood with Hussein. By any objective assessment, there was no real fight to be had. It was a virtual foregone conclusion that Hussein's party would be overwhelmed. The fact that a negotiation did not avert bloodshed is precisely what has made the ensuing event so deeply seared into the collective memory of Muslims, particularly the Shia. Traditionally, Karbala has been depicted as a stark moral confrontation, with Yazid cast as the archetype of tyranny and Hussein as the exemplar of righteousness, courage, and sacrifice. This narrative has powerful emotional resonance, especially in the annual Shia commemoration of Ashura, which focuses on mourning Hussein's martyrdom. Yet the secret that emerges from beneath layers of religious devotion, historical retelling, and centuries of sectarian polemics is that this massacre was as much, if not more, about raw political power than about religious doctrine. Yazid needed to snuff out any credible opposition to his rule. He needed to demonstrate that defiance would be met with swift, brutal retribution. Hussein wasn't just a distant cousin of the Prophet or a revered figure among pious Muslims. He was a living symbol of the alternative authority that threatened Yazid's caliphate. To let Hussein gather strength could have upended the political order that Muawiyah had so carefully fashioned. Thus, in October of that fateful year, Hussein and his companions found themselves effectively surrounded. Their access to water was cut off, an act that would have horrific humanitarian implications, given the scorching climate and the presence of children and women in Hussein's camp. Days of standoff ended in a single morning of unspeakable violence. The men in Hussein's party, vastly outnumbered, fought valiantly but were cut down. Hussein himself, according to Shia tradition, displayed immense bravery and resilience before he was killed. In the aftermath, the women and children were taken captive. Many accounts, especially in Shia sources, detail the desecration of Hussein's body, the looting of his camp, and a parade of prisoners that Yazid's forces intended to display as a warning to anyone else who might consider defiance. Yet, for all its cruelty, the Karbala massacre was never meant to be widely celebrated as a triumph. On the contrary, contemporary observers note that Yazid's court seemed to go out of its way to control the story, to hush any rumors of disproportionate brutality. Yes, Hussein was a potential rebel, but he was also, unavoidably, the grandson of the Prophet, someone who commanded profound respect and love among Muslims. Killing him was a gravely risky move in terms of public opinion. Even many who otherwise supported the Umayyad regime might be scandalized by the deliberate targeting of the Prophet's family. Yazid's greatest fear, arguably, was not a pitched battle in the desert, but the wave of outrage that might follow in the broader community. That is where we see the secret. It wasn't about religious confrontation in a purely theological sense. The deeper motive rooted in power consolidation was meticulously hidden behind layers of propaganda and official rationalizations. Yazid likely justified it as a crackdown on insurrection, painting Hussein's uprising as a dangerous civil disorder that had to be quelled. In the days and months that followed, the Umayyad apparatus reportedly suppressed news of Karbala's savagery. In official proclamations, the events were either downplayed as unfortunate or framed as the consequence of an ill-advised rebellion by Hussein. As time went on, some even tried to retroactively cast blame entirely upon Ibn Ziyad, the governor of Kufa, as if Yazid himself had been horrified by the scope of the violence. Yet the chain of command ultimately led back to Yazid, and the notion that he was ignorant of how events would unfold stretches credulity. Al-Baladuri, a noted historian of the period, preserved glimpses of the brutality in his writings. While not always as detailed as later Shia elegies, he provides enough to paint a stark portrait: the cutting off of water, the scorching days of thirst, and the final ruthless onslaught against Hussein's tiny band. In the centuries since, Shia literature has expanded upon these details, often focusing on the harrowing experiences of the Prophet's great-grandchildren. It is in these accounts, poems, laments, and sermons that the emotional power of Karbala resonates most sharply. Reading them, it becomes impossible not to sense that the official story from Yazid's court was drastically sanitized. To appreciate the scale of such image manipulation, it's helpful to draw parallels with other episodes in history, where power holders stage-managed or outright concealed their most egregious actions to maintain legitimacy. Think of Carnegie's Homestead strike in 1892, where Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick attempted to crush steelworkers' demands for better labor conditions with lethal force, only to spin the narrative afterward to portray themselves as innocent guardians of order. Or consider the Habsburgs, who in various parts of their empire used the machinery of the Inquisition, not so much for religious purity, but to cement their political power and quell dissent. And in more modern times, corporations like DuPont have faced accusations of concealing the toxic impact of chemicals like PFOA, prioritizing profit and corporate stability over the safety of the public. These cases, across different eras and contexts, share a common thread. Those in power commit or enable acts of great harm, yet strive to maintain a sanitized public image by restricting access to the grim truth or reframing the narrative to deflect blame. In Yazid's time, the tools of secrecy and propaganda were not quite as refined or wide-reaching as they are in the modern digital age. Yet controlling the message was still possible, particularly when you held the reins of governance, the treasury, and the military. Ensuring that uncomfortable details didn't spread too far beyond local witnesses might involve bribery, intimidation, or simply the omission of the event from official records. We do know that word of Karbala eventually got out. The raw horror of Hussein's death, the captivity of his family, and the subsequent humiliations visited upon them by Yazid's forces became a central grievance among those who opposed the Umayyad regime. Even so, the court's attempt to minimize the outcry was partly successful for a time, though not successful enough to prevent future revolts. Indeed, the trauma of Karbala galvanized Shia communities to an extent that would leave an indelible mark on Islamic history. Hussein's stand became a symbol of moral resistance against tyranny, overshadowing any attempts by Yazid to present it as mere rebellion. That said, it's important to avoid an overly simplistic portrayal of Yazid as a cartoon villain. Some modern critics, as well as certain pious narratives, paint him as the embodiment of all evil, suggesting he took sadistic glee in murdering the Prophet's family. But as with most historical figures, the reality is likely more nuanced. Yazid's motivations could have been rooted in genuine fear that Hussein's leadership claim would fracture the empire. He might have believed that a quick show of force would deter future rebellions, saving countless lives in the long run by consolidating power. None of this excuses the moral weight of Karbala, but it does shift our perspective away from a purely religious lens. We see a ruler, anxious to maintain the dynasty his father established, resorting to extreme measures. We see a man who understood that to preserve the Umayyad hold on the caliphate, he had to neutralize any charismatic figure with a legitimate or semi-legitimate claim, and few claims were more potent than that of the Prophet's grandson. If you step back and look at the bigger historical arc, Karbala emerges as a turning point, the slaughter that split Islam. While the split between what would become Sunni and Shia Islam had earlier roots, particularly surrounding the question of Ali's succession, the massacre of Hussein cemented that fault line in a permanent way. From this moment onward, Shia identity was inextricably tied to martyrdom, protest, and the moral condemnation of tyranny. Commemorations of Ashura not only lamented Hussein's killing, but also offered a powerful counter-narrative to the official Umayyad line. The more Yazid tried to spin events, the more the Shia told the story in stirring, emotional detail, highlighting every act of brutality. Over time, these lamentations served as a unifying force for communities disenchanted with Umayyad rule, and eventually with other ruling elites who displayed similarly authoritarian or corrupt tendencies. This phenomenon of a state narrative clashing with a popular or counter-narrative is hardly unique to 7th century Arabia. If you look at medieval Europe, for instance, you might find chronicle after chronicle describing the ruthless acts of monarchs who then commissioned official scribes to produce royal histories that conveniently omitted the bloodier details. In the subsequent centuries, totalitarian regimes around the globe have mirrored these tactics, rewriting textbooks, restricting eyewitness accounts, and punishing whistleblowers in an effort to maintain an illusion of benevolent leadership. The story of Karbala thus resonates with anyone who has ever witnessed how power can corrupt and how the victors might attempt to shape the historical record to vindicate themselves. It is, in many ways, a universal cautionary tale. If the Prophet's own kin could fall victim to the brutal calculus of realpolitik, then there is no realm of human society safe from the manipulations of those who crave or cling to power. For the Shia, the memory of Karbala became not just a historical grievance, but a moral compass. Every year, millions of Shia around the world engage in rituals of mourning and reflection on Ashura, remembering the thirst, the cries of children, the lonely stand of Hussein, and the captivity of the women. These observances are not only religious in nature, they are also intensely political. For centuries, they have served as an implicit rebuke to unjust rulers, reinforcing the idea that standing against tyranny is a sacred duty, even if the odds are hopeless. This spiritual political synergy is precisely what Yazid wanted to avoid. He feared that a charismatic figure from the Prophet's family could rally the masses. Ironically, by making Hussein a martyr, Yazid laid the seeds for the phenomenon he most dreaded, the eternal veneration of Hussein as a champion of truth, overshadowing any attempts to vilify him as a mere rebel. Despite the efforts of Yazid's court to contain or distort the story, accounts of Karbala spread rapidly along caravan routes and through traveling preachers. The details varied, but the essence remained consistent. Hussein was outnumbered, deprived of water, and slaughtered with his followers in a single, horrifying day. The captivity of the prophet's female relatives, especially his granddaughters, added an extra layer of pathos. Shia tradition holds that Zainab, Hussein's sister, played a key role in preserving the memory of these events, confronting Yazid in his own court and denouncing the injustice openly. Whether that confrontation happened exactly as described is less important than the symbolic weight it carries. Abd al-Malik stood at the edge of the Umayyad palace courtyard in Damascus, gazing across the marble tiles that reflected the pale morning light. Behind him, servants drifted in a hush of activity, but his focus was on the distant horizon, on that thin line where the dusty roads of the empire's interior cut through rolling desert plains. His caliphate was far from secure. The second fitna, that rolling storm of rebellions and civil conflicts tearing at the seams of the Islamic world, had already swallowed too many lives and fortunes. He knew that if he didn't act decisively, the Umayyad dynasty his predecessors had fought for could soon become another cautionary tale in the annals of Islamic history. Publicly, of course, he projected absolute confidence, the unwavering smile of a ruler sanctioned by fate. Privately, he was consumed by worry, constantly eyeing the swirl of forces that threatened his control: rival claimants, fractious tribes, opportunistic generals. And so, while common wisdom might suggest forging alliances through trust and piety, Abd al-Malik had learned that golden titles could be far more persuasive. In the hush of hidden corridors and under the shadow of half-drawn curtains, he would orchestrate deals that would never make it into the official records. These bribes, discreetly extended to certain tribal leaders of Qais and Yaman, would become the keystone of his grand strategy, an almost invisible glue binding together an empire on the brink of shattering. He had found through observation of human nature that men who preached honor often had a price. It wasn't always straightforward. Some demanded gold to fill their coffers, others wanted positions at court or the promise of family marriages that would anchor their bloodlines into the ruling elite. Each handshake had to be accompanied by the right whispers, each gift bestowed at the right moment. The empire was reeling from civil strife, and though the masses knew vaguely of political intrigue, few suspected the depths of secret negotiations. The major tribal blocs, especially Qais and Yaman, remained powerhouses across the provinces, each alliance a critical pivot for armies. If you had them on your side, you got more than just a few cavalry units or an extra 1,000-foot soldiers. You secured local legitimacy, the intangible aura of tribal blessings that could diffuse potential revolts. Abd al-Malik recognized that forging such alliances publicly could stir jealousy among other factions or spark moral outrage among those who believed in a more principled approach to governance. Better, then, to make these pacts in private, insulating himself from scandal. Thus, he supervised a steady stream of gifts, fine fabrics, silver, precious stones, channeling them into the right hands while promising positions in the Umayyad court to influential sheikhs. Those deals formed the hidden scaffolding of his eventual victory over the Zubayrids in 691 CE. Yet for all the hush around these bribes, rumors inevitably filtered out, carried by travelers stopping in small desert outposts to trade stories and news. Some found the idea scandalous. Wasn't a caliph supposed to lead through virtue, not payoffs? Others shrugged, cynical about the ways of power. The official chronicles of the time tended to minimize or completely omit the subject, but future historians like Ibn Khaldun, known for his analysis of tribal dynamics, left tantalizing hints. In certain genealogical records, the abrupt rise of lesser-known tribal chieftains to prestigious court positions begs explanation, especially when it happened right on the cusp of critical battles during the Second Fitna. Those who read between the lines saw the clear pattern. These men had joined Abd al-Malik's side at precisely the right moment, trading their loyalty for wealth and status. This hidden traffic in influence would go on to shape not only the final outcome of the civil war, but also the broader tapestry of the Umayyad state. To some observers, those invisible negotiations were more consequential than any single battle. When you picture the swirl of drama at the time, it helps to recall that the Second Fitna was not a simple U.S. versus them conflict. The early Islamic empire, barely half a century old, was expanding rapidly, absorbing diverse peoples, tongues, and traditions. In that environment, power was more fluid, shifting rapidly with tribal alliances. The Zubayrid faction controlled Mecca for a time and tried to legitimize itself as a truer continuation of the Caliphate, rallying many in the Hejaz. Meanwhile, Kharijiti uprisings flared here and there, challenging both the Zubayrids and the Umayyads. The mosaic was complicated by tribal rivalries that preceded Islam, and those old hostilities didn't just vanish overnight. The Kasi and Yamani tribes had their own histories of competition, and it was by carefully balancing their interests, often with bribes, that Abd al-Malik navigated the labyrinth of feuds. According to certain lines in Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, paying off different segments of a tribe was a time-honored tradition in the region, a practical approach that some might call tribal diplomacy. Yet in Abd al-Malik's case, the scale and importance of these bribes reached unprecedented heights, as if the fate of the empire quite literally hinged upon the right distribution of wealth and power. From a modern perspective, we might compare Abd al-Malik's strategy to European rulers who secured their thrones through clandestine deals. Take the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, known for his marriage strategies and occasional electoral bribery to ensure the imperial crown stayed within Habsburg hands. Or consider the notorious Erie scandal in 19th century America, where Jay Gould and his associates bribed politicians and judges to gain control of the Erie Railroad, rewriting the rules to pad their fortunes. Like Abd al-Malik, these figures recognize that moral arguments alone rarely sway the outcome of high-stakes power struggles. Documents might be forged, alliances declared, but ultimately, a well-placed gift or preferential appointment often decided who wore the crown or who controlled the rails. The difference, though, is that in many of those later Western examples, the bribes came to public light, leading to scandal and attempts at reform. In Abd al-Malik's world, secrecy was more thorough, aided by a political culture less reliant on widespread literacy or consistent record-keeping. While rumors circulated, official histories downplayed the topic, focusing instead on the glories of military victories or the caliph's pious undertakings. The cultural impact of these secret bribes went beyond their immediate effect on the war. By co-opting tribal chiefs with wealth and titles, Abd al-Malik was also shaping the nature of Umayyad governance, centralizing power in Damascus and reorienting the tribal system away from fractious local feuds toward a court-centered hierarchy. The men who accepted his bribes tended to shift their focus from desert strongholds to the palatial circles in the capital. Their presence in Damascus, wearing the best robes and consulting on state matters, introduced new influences. They brought with them local myths, traditions, feuds, and alliances, all now integrated into an Umayyad tapestry that was becoming more cosmopolitan every year, yet the unspoken price was loyalty. If a bribed chieftain began to have second thoughts, perhaps resenting the overshadowing presence of the caliph, he'd have to think twice. The court position, the privileges, the share of spoils might vanish if he defected. Many, if not most, chose to remain within Abd al-Malik's orbit, grateful or trapped by the wealth that had come their way. That subtle shift helped ensure that when it came time for the decisive confrontation with the Zubayrids, the Qays and Yaman forces either stayed out of the fray or directly bolstered Abd al-Malik. Historically, the official reason was tribal reconciliation or restoring unity. The truth was typically less lofty. Bribes had turned potential enemies into allies. That tension between official narrative and behind-the-scenes reality was reminiscent of certain chapters in Medici history, but with a twist. The Medici, notorious for open reprisals and displays of power in Renaissance Florence, rarely concealed their maneuvers. When they needed to eliminate rivals or crush conspiracies like the Pazzi, they did so in a public, almost theatrical way, sending a message to friend and foe alike. Abd al-Malik, conversely, worked in the shadows. He wanted no grand spectacle of revenge or intimidation. Brutality might spark further rebellions, which were the last thing he needed during the fragile years of the Second Fitna. Instead, he recognized that a handful of carefully placed bribes could achieve more than any open crackdown. People who had grown used to the idea of conflicts being settled on the battlefield were now encountering a new kind of tactic: infiltration of their leadership, infiltration of their pockets. Some of the older, more idealistic warriors found it distasteful. They'd have preferred an open fight where the best swordsmen or the bravest cavalry carried the day. But times were changing, and so were the tools of empire building. A few decades later, as the Umayyad state solidified its reach, the memory of those quiet deals remained strong among certain tribes, especially in private circles, where elders reminisced about the day they sold their loyalty or were forced to accept the caliph's gold. To younger generations, it sounded like myth or exaggeration. Could it be that the famed Abd al-Malik, known for his administrative reforms and architectural grandeur, such as his commissioning of the Dome of the Rock, had relied on bribes? The official history spoke more about his wise governance, his piety, and his success at reuniting the empire. Mention of bribery surfaced only sporadically, often framed in ambiguous terms. He bestowed great favor upon the tribes, ensuring their loyalty and binding their hearts. Yet genealogical records showed abrupt leaps in status for men from certain clans. One might find a minor sheikh whose father had been a provincial nobody suddenly officiating in the heart of Damascus, overseeing a strategic region, or marrying into an influential line. Ibn Khaldun, though writing centuries later, recognized this pattern as a hallmark of states that rely on tribal alliances. He noted that leaders often employed lavish gifts or positions to quell dissent, especially in times of civil strife. He never explicitly labeled them bribes, but the implication was clear: valuable tokens of favoritism exchanged for loyalty and silence. Scholars today, comparing these records with statements from early Islamic historians, see the puzzle pieces align. They point to the year 691 CE, just before Abd al-Malik definitively defeated the Zubayrids, as a tipping point. Reliable sources note that certain Qaysi tribes who had been lukewarm at best toward Umayyad rule suddenly switched allegiances, marching under Abd al-Malik's banner. The Yaman tribes, too, became surprisingly cooperative. And, indeed, after the campaign ended, many of the leaders from those tribes found themselves rewarded with positions close to the caliph or governor's seats in lucrative provinces. The pattern would hardly be coincidental, yet the artistry of Abd al-Malik's approach lay in the secrecy. Letters exchanged in private, pledges made in lamplit chambers far from prying eyes. That hush ensured that the general population wouldn't rise up in disgust or question the caliph's moral authority. As far as official propaganda was concerned, the empire was reuniting under the banner of faith, ushered along by the rightful caliph. In quiet corners of the empire, more cynical minds recognized that gold, not principle, was forging the union. It's important to note that while these bribes were documented enough for historians to piece together long after the fact, the details remain hazy. We don't have, for example, a single letter listing exact sums or itemized lists of who received how much gold. Nor is there a surviving contract that states, I, Abd al-Malik, do hereby bribe so-and-so in exchange for his tribe's loyalty. These deals were presumably hammered out informally, sealed by oath or handshake, leaving few traces on official parchment. Thus we rely on the testimony of chroniclers, who took note of suspiciously timed alliances or genealogies that reveal startling leaps in rank or fortune. Some modern critics point out that labeling them bribes might be anachronistic, given the political norms of the era. After all, in many pre-modern societies, distributing gifts and wealth to secure loyalty was part of standard governance, not necessarily seen as corruption, but context matters. The hush, the discreet nature of these dealings suggests that even within that world, something about them went beyond the usual gift-giving. If it were wholly acceptable, Abd al-Malik would have boasted about his generosity openly, rather than quietly handing out gold behind the scenes. Comparisons to other historical episodes can be illuminating. Maximilian I, for instance, famously maneuvered the electors of the Holy Roman Empire to ensure his family's dominance in Central Europe. There, we see a mix of open negotiation and covert payoffs, culminating in a dynastic strategy that endured for centuries. The difference is that Maximilian's behavior, though occasionally criticized, occurred within a legal structure where electors expected gifts in return for votes. It was a somewhat accepted political tradition in that corner of the world. In Abd al-Malik's scenario, the scale of tribal involvement and the risk of the entire empire fracturing made it both more desperate and more crucial to keep quiet. The tribes represented not just a handful of elector counts or barons. They were enormous swaths of the population, each with a proud identity predating Islam, each capable of mobilizing for or against the caliph. A single miscalculation, a tribal leader feeling insulted or underpaid, could swing entire regions into rebellion, tipping the scales in favor of the Zubayrids or other enemies. The mention of Gould's Erie scandal in 19th century America further underscores how bribery can transform the fate of institutions. Jay Gould and his partners effectively hacked the legal and financial system, paying off legislators and judges to outmaneuver rival Cornelius Vanderbilt for control of the railroad. Their success story for a while was overshadowed by the ethical ramifications. Ultimately, part of the scandal was exposed, tarnishing reputations and fueling calls for reform. For Abd al-Malik, no such wave of transparency or reform threatened him. The concept of an open press or watchdog institutions didn't exist in the same sense. Still, he had to worry about his spiritual and moral reputation. As caliph, he held a role that was not merely political, but also religious. He was seen as the community's leader in a broad sense. An accusation of un-Islamic conduct could erode his base, possibly awakening the same fervor that had rallied so many behind the Prophet's descendants or other charismatic leaders. Quiet bribery thus served a dual purpose. It got him the allies he needed and allowed him to keep a respectable veneer in the public eye. The moment that sealed his triumph was the battle that effectively crushed Ibn al-Zubayr's forces. Many historians trace the victory directly to the newfound support from key tribal contingents who swung the balance. A swirl of testimonies suggests that these tribes, days before the confrontation, had been courted by Abd al-Malik's messengers, with offers too good to refuse. Once the Zubayrids were vanquished, Abd al-Malik famously consolidated the empire's governance, introducing administrative reforms that included the introduction of an Islamic currency and standardizing the language of bureaucracy. The official records praised him as a unifier, a statesman who ended the strife and ushered in an era of relative stability. Yet behind that public portrait lurked the knowledge that some portion of that stability had been purchased in dimly lit chambers. Secret. Despite their Arab-Islamic rule, Umayyads relied heavily on Christian administrators like Sarjun ibn Mansur, who ran Syria's fiscal system until 700 CE per al-Baladhri. Abd al-Malik's Arabicization push ousted them, hiding their critical role to emphasize Arab supremacy, like Hearst's media sanitization. Webb, Zero Development Angle, investigate Byzantine tax records, or al-Tabari's accounts for Sarjun's influence. Compare to Astor's social gatekeeping or Habsburg's religious cover-ups for image control. Frame as the Christians who ran an Islamic empire. Critical note: Christian roles are verified, concealment is plausible but not explicit. Ex posts, post 3, misalign Umayyads with modern states. Secret: Al-Walidin's desert palaces, e.g. Qasr Emra, Mashhada, built circa 700 to 750 CE, were lavish retreats with figurative art per Metropolitan Museum. Their secular opulence was downplayed to counter accusations of impiety, unlike Vanderbilt's public mansions. Web 20, Development Angle, analyze archaeological reports or frescoes at Qasr Amra for extravagance details. Compare to Guggenheim's Titanic affair or Onassis's yacht for hidden luxury. Frame as the palaces that defied Islamic piety. Critical note: palaces are factual, secrecy is inferred from religious critiques. X claims of hidden treasures, post 0, lack evidence. Secret: in 750 CE, the Abbasids massacred most Umayyads, but spared Umar II's tomb and allowed Abd al-Rahman Furn's escape to Spain, per World History Encyclopedia. Secret negotiations with select Umayyads ensured Córdoba's rise, unlike Plantagenet's princes in the Tower finality. Web 613. Development Angle, examine Abbasid chronicles or Córdoba histories for negotiation clues. Compare to Carnegie's Frick feud or Astor's elder abuse for dynastic betrayals. Frame as the Umayyads who escaped to slaughter. Critical note: massacre and escape are verified, negotiations are plausible but undocumented. Ex post, post 7, overstate survivor numbers.